So good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you about the Star of Bethlehem. Let's start with a few seconds of mood music. Okay, no time for the whole carol. So in this talk, I'm going to cover a number of points. I'm going to briefly look at the Gospel of St. Matthew and look at the account of the Magi and the star in the east. I'm not going to make any comment about the validity of the account. I'm going to ask the question, are there any astronomical candidates we know about that could possibly account for the Star of Bethlehem? In other words, what might have been in the sky and how well do they fit the account? And then I'm going to think about the dates. What actually happened in terms of what appearances were in the sky in the years, a few years BC, and were there any events that we know about that fit the timeline of the Nativity? And then I'm going to use a piece of software, a piece of planetarium software, to show you what was in the sky 2,000 years ago. And we'll have a look at candidates for the Star of Bethlehem. And then I'll have a brief summary and then finish. So firstly, let's look at the principal elements of Matthew's account that we are trying to deal with. It is said in the account that the Magi journeyed to Jerusalem prompted by a star in the east. The first thing in red is the first thing we have to take into account. Bear in mind that the account does not say that they followed a star, but simply that they were prompted by a star in the east. They asked Herod about what's this we hear about the King of the Jews, and Herod was unaware of what it was they were talking about. The Magi continued on to Bethlehem, where the star reappeared in the south and then finally stopped over Bethlehem. So in red there are the 5 elements of the Gospel according to St. Matthew that we are trying to address. Can we find an astronomical candidate for an object that might have been in the sky and meets those 5 criteria and hence could, in principle, be a candidate for the Star of Bethlehem? So let's return temporarily to the wonderful Christmas carol and let's just listen to the lyric of the first verse. Okay, we don't need too much of that. But when we start thinking about the account of St. Matthew, we realise that this Christmas carol is not entirely accurate. So, for instance, the opening line, "We 3 kings of Orient are." Well, actually, there's no indication that there were 3 magi or 3 wise men or 3 kings. The account doesn't talk about 3 people. There's simply an assumption that there were 3. Why do we assume that there were 3 people? Well, because the account does mention 3 gifts, the gold, frankincense and myrrh. So if there were 3 gifts, presumably there were 3 magi or 3 wise men. Perhaps there weren't. Perhaps there were 27 of them, 3 of whom brought gifts, and the other 24 started looking at each other saying, I didn't get the memo, were we supposed to bring gifts? So we know there were 3 gifts and it's assumed that there were 3 wise men. So we shouldn't really be talking about 3 because that's just an assumption. And yes, translations of the account give you either magi, the plural of magus, or wise men, but nowhere does it actually say that these 3 people were kings, so we shouldn't talk about kings either. And where did they actually come from? Well, there's no actual mention of their homeland. We don't know if it was the Near East, if it was India, if it was Mongolia, if it was the Far East, the Orient. So we really shouldn't be specifically talking about the Orient either. And as I've mentioned earlier, the account of St Matthew does not talk about them following a star, it talks about them being prompted by a star. So we ought to get rid of that line as well. So you can see that the Christmas carol is starting to get very threadbare once we start removing the things that we have no justification for including. Being a scientist, of course, I like things to be accurate and precise, so we shouldn't be talking about "We Three Kings of Orient Are." We should really change the lyrics into something a little more explicit. So, for instance, it should be, "We indeterminate number of men of unspecified geographic origin are." And instead of following yonder star, we should just say "saw a star." And now you get a real feeling for why it is that scientists do not write Christmas carols. Okay. And again, we shouldn't be talking about three wise men. We should only refer to n wise men, where n is a number greater than 1 and less than infinity. We know it's greater than 1 because it's always plural. It's always wise men or magi. So we know there's more than one, but we can't specify how many. When we're talking about the Star of Bethlehem, we must remember to use the word star in the very liberal sense. A star doesn't mean a star in the sense that we understand it astronomically today. So, for instance, we might talk about the stars in the sky and the fixed stars, the constellations, the patterns in the sky, which are always there, but there are also other stars that appear in the sky, wandering stars, for instance, a star that appears still like a point of light, like all the other stars, but will appear to move from night to night, from month to month. They will move across the sky compared to all the fixed stars. The stars still seem to move because of the Earth's rotation, but they stay fixed relative to each other, whereas a wandering star seems to move throughout the constellations. We now call them planets, but wandering star was how they were originally referred to. And similarly, another type of star is a hairy star, a star that seems to have a tail or hair coming off it. We would now call that a comet, but hairy star was how they were referred to in days of yore. And one instance of a use of a word star that actually is still in colloquial usage is a shooting star. We now generally refer to them as meteors and talk about meteor showers, but of course shooting star is still quite a colloquial phrase that's still used for the same thing. So we should remember that star could mean a star, or it could mean a planet, or it could mean a comet, or it could mean a meteor. It essentially means anything that might have been seen in the night sky. We should not take the word star too literally. Okay. Do we have any clues from artwork of hundreds of years ago? Okay, Botticelli, 1475. This is of course still closer to the present day than it was to the birth of Christ, but it's 500 years ago. Do we have any clues in the depiction of the adoration of the Magi here? Well, this particular painting was by Botticelli, and it's widely believed that this person on the right, who seems to be looking into the painter's eyes, was Botticelli himself. So this is a 500-year-old selfie, if you like, which happens to have the adoration of the Magi in the background. Presumably this is the Star of Bethlehem. It's not too clear what's going on, but that, I guess, is what's supposed to be at the top of this particular painting. Joseph in the background is looking rather bored. He doesn't seem to have any part to play in the celebration here. Perhaps that's appropriate, as he didn't have any part to play in the conception either, so maybe that's appropriate. If we look at other depictions of the adoration of the Magi, this is a few years earlier, and again we see what we presume to be the Star of Bethlehem in the background, but it gives us no clue as to what that star might have been. Giotto in 1300, even earlier, does give us an indication that maybe the Star of Bethlehem was a comet. This is one of the few depictions of the adoration of the Magi in which the Star of Bethlehem does not appear simply as a point of light, but seems to have a quite definite tail, and we assume that was the appearance of a comet. Do we get any clues from Rubens? I'm not sure what the date was for this. In this particular case, we look at the sky in the background and we don't seem to see the Star of Bethlehem. Perhaps it's hidden somewhere behind that two-headed camel that we can see in the background there, but we can't really get a handle on the Star of Bethlehem. 1655, coming a little more up to date. Again, we don't really get a clue. Its depiction here, the Star of Bethlehem, appears to be a point of light, not a comet in this case. This doesn't appear to be a tail. This is just some light from the star shining down onto the baby Jesus. And similarly, Van Lint, 1630, again we see the three magi, always three, it's never anything else. And again we see what appears to be a point-light star shining down onto the baby Jesus. So it's no surprise perhaps that if we look at paintings of the adoration of the Magi, these are not supposed to be historical documents. They are depictions that people expect to see. They expect to see the baby Jesus, they expect to see the three Magi, maybe they expect to see the Star of Bethlehem in the sky as well. But it is not a historical depiction, therefore we can't really get anything from such paintings. But if we ask ourselves about how astrology worked 2,000 years ago, we have to remember that every planet, every bright star, every zodiacal constellation, the constellations of the zodiac through which the sun and the moon and the planets appear to move throughout the year, all of these objects had some astrological significance. For instance, Venus was often associated with beauty or fertility or birth. Jupiter was often associated with royalty and was considered to be the king of planets. Regulus is the brightest star in the constellation of Leo, and as its name suggests, it was considered to be the king of stars. And Leo itself was often associated with the land and the tribe of Judea, simply because their flag or their emblem was a lion, and therefore the lion in the sky was thought to represent the Lion of Judea. So why did astrologers continually look at the sky in order to give this collection of planets and stars and constellations particular significance? Well, that was because that they believed that whatever happened in the sky, it was a portent, it was a sign, it was a forecast of what is likely to happen in the future. In other words, the fate of mankind is dictated by what God chooses to put in the sky. If you can read the sky, then you can read the future. If you want the simplest interpretation of that, you can think of the sky as God's Facebook page. That's where he's going to post anything that interesting is going to happen in the next few weeks, the next few months, the next few years. That's where you're going to find it. If you keep an eye on the sky, you'll get a heads up of what's likely to be coming your way. So astrology in that sense was very important. Let's have a think about what star candidates could possibly have been the Star of Bethlehem. We're going to think about a few candidates, and then written there are the 5 elements of the Gospel according to St. Matthew that I mentioned earlier. If we find a candidate, we're going to have to ask the question, could it have been a star in the east? Would it have been significant? Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of this star? Could that star reappear in the sky, and could that star stop in the sky? If we can find a candidate that ticks all those 5 boxes, then we might have found a candidate for the Star of Bethlehem. Could the Star of Bethlehem been a shooting star? Could it have been a meteor? Well, why would you talk about a meteor being a star in the east? Meteors tend to appear all over the sky as a flash of light, a streak of light, and when a meteor shower appears in the sky, they could be all over the sky. There's no particular reason why you would say a star appeared in the east. It wouldn't be particularly significant because meteors occur essentially every night and meteor showers occur throughout the year. So yes, Herod wouldn't necessarily be aware of what the Magi were talking about if they referred to a meteor shower, because they happen all the time. Could a meteor shower reappear in the sky? Yes, meteor showers occur at various times of year, and once a particular shower has faded away, some weeks later there might be another meteor shower. So yes, the star could reappear in the sky. But how would you possibly talk about the star stopping in the sky? Meteors are generally flashes of light, streaks of light, and there's no reason why you would talk about a meteor stopping in the sky. So it meets some of the criteria, but not enough. Could it have been a comet? This is widely thought to be the case, that it could indeed have been a comet. Could it have been In the east, well, yes, a comet could appear in principle anywhere in the sky, so yes, it could certainly appear in the east. If it was bright enough, it would certainly have been deemed significant. Bright comets were thought to be the harbingers of doom or news of a rather nicer nature, not necessarily bad news. Is it possible Herod wasn't aware of it? Well, if the comet was bright enough to be significant, surely Herod would have been aware of it. Herod didn't actually have very good eyesight, but he had a whole set of astrologers who would have been advising him, and surely they would have been aware of it. Could the star reappear in the sky? Well, comets go round the sun like all of the other planets in the solar system, so it's possible that a comet appears in the sky, and for a while it might go behind the sun and then reappear on the other side, so yes, the star could reappear in the sky. What about the star stopping in the sky? Well, that's a little bit of a question mark. Generally speaking, when comets pass by the Earth, they tend to move from night to night, from week to week, as they pass through various constellations in the sky. It's possible that depending on the orbit of the comet, it might be that for a few days the comet might be not moving from west to east or east to west particularly fast and might appear to stop in the sky. So a little bit of a question mark on that one. What about a nova? A nova is a new star. Not strictly speaking a new star in the sense of a star appearing from nothing, but what it means is a star that was probably too faint to see or too faint to be noticed suddenly gets brighter and suddenly becomes very visible. So yes, such a star could indeed appear in the east. Depending on how bright it was, it could be significant. Again, we've got the question, well, if it was bright enough to be significant, why wouldn't Herod also be aware of the star? And could the star reappear in the sky? Well, stars can brighten quite substantially in their brightness over a period of a few days or a few weeks and then fade away again. But generally speaking, they won't go through the same cycle a few weeks or a few months later. Maybe 20 years later, maybe 100 years later, they might go through a cycle again. It's unlikely that they go through cycles so that they appear and then a few months later reappear in the sky. So that's unlikely. Could the star stop in the sky? Well, a nova is a star like any other in respect of it's one of the fixed stars. So it will appear somewhere in the sky, but it will move with all of the other stars during the night as the Earth rotates. It won't move relative to the other stars. So to talk about that star stopping in the sky makes no sense. What about a supernova? This is a star that, as its name would imply, brightens a great deal from its probably previously invisible state to a very bright star. How bright it appears depends on exactly how far away the star might be. Generally, a supernova is a star coming to the end of its life, a very massive star. As it uses up all of its fuel and can no longer support its own mass, will collapse and produce an enormous explosion. That's what a supernova is. Could it have been significant? Well, if it was close enough to be very bright, certainly it would have been significant. Is it possible Herod wasn't aware of it? Again, we have the same problem. If it was bright enough to be significant, why wasn't it bright enough that Herod wasn't also aware of its existence? Could it reappear in the sky? Well, a supernova is basically a star blowing itself to pieces. So, having done it once, very unlikely to do it a second time. Once a star has gone supernova, that's pretty much it. So it can't really reappear in the sky. Can the star stop in the sky? Well, for the same reason as a nova, a supernova would appear at a particular point relative to the fixed stars and wouldn't move relative to the fixed stars. So why would you ever talk about it stopping in the sky? So you can see that some of those candidates tick some of the boxes, but we haven't found yet a candidate that meets all the criteria until the fifth one, which, as you can probably tell, is the one that I favour at the moment. Could it have been different planets wandering through the sky and coming close to each other in the sky, a so-called conjunction? This here is the astrological symbol for a conjunction. It simply means two planets getting close together in the sky. Could it have appeared in the east? Yes, indeed. The conjunctions can occur at various places, so certainly in the east. Would it have been significant? Well, it depends on the astrological significance applied to which planets were involved and in which constellation did they appear to come together in the sky. Would it be possible that Herod wasn't aware of it? Well, it would, in the sense that, well, it depends on what astrological significance you actually attach to this. It might be that Herod was indeed aware of the fact that certain planets were in the sky, but he didn't necessarily apply the same argument in terms of the interpretation that the Magi might have applied. Could it reappear in the sky? Yes, as we will see shortly, planets go round the sun and they move in the sky, and sometimes they're a long way apart, and sometimes they appear to be very close in the sky. And as they can move further apart and then move closer together again. So yes, a conjunction of planets can reappear in the sky. Is it possible that such a star could stop in the sky? And yes, for the reason I'm going to show you shortly. So it looks like we might have a candidate here. It looks like we might have a possibility of a conjunction meeting all of the requirements of the account, the Gospel according to St. Matthew. We haven't dealt with the timing yet of when these conjunctions occurred, but at least it's a possibility. Before we look at timing, let's just make sure we understand how planets move around the sun. Here are two hypothetical planets. It doesn't really matter which ones they are. The point being, as they go round the sun, planets that are closer to the sun go round faster than planets that are further away from the sun. So you could say that as seen from the sun, these two planets at the moment seem to be in the same part of the sky. They seem to be in the same direction. But as time goes by, one planet goes faster than the other, so they are now in different parts of the sky. But here, they seem to be in the same part of the sky again, and now they're in different parts of the sky, and if we wait long enough, now they are in the same part of the sky again. So this just reminds us that different planets move at different speeds. And that is the reason that another phenomena that we will see, if we imagine that the green planet here is Earth, so this is the vantage point that we are making our observations, imagine there's a planet further away from the sun, like Mars or Jupiter or Saturn. Then Mars or Jupiter or Saturn will move around the sun, and from night to night will seem to move from west to east. But because the Earth is in an orbit that's inside, closer to the sun, the Earth will be moving faster. So at certain points of its orbit, the Earth will be moving faster than the planet, and so just like when you're overtaking a car on the motorway, you're both moving forward, but if you're overtaking a car, the car you're overtaking seems temporarily to be moving backwards relative to you. The same can happen with planets. All the planets will be moving in the same direction around the sky, but if the Earth is overtaking on the inside lane, as it were, and moving faster, it can make one of those planets appear to move backwards. So in terms of tracing out the path of the planet in the sky, a planet might seem to move forward, and then as the Earth overtakes it, the planet moves backwards, and then as the Earth moves a little further round in its orbit, the planet continues. So if we think of a planet starting from here, the path on the night sky might be west to east, but then the planet can stop in the sky and start moving backwards, and then stop in the sky and start moving forwards again. This particular little dance, this idea of moving forwards and then backwards and then forwards again, is called retrograde motion. Normally the planets are going west to east. For a little while, which might be weeks or months at a time, the planet might appear to be moving backwards. So let's just see that little dance again. It goes forwards and then stops in the sky, moves backward for a while, and then stops in the sky and moves forward again. So remember that little dance, that little zigzag, that little S shape, because we're going to see that shortly. Let's think about the timing. It's the last element we need. A conjunction might fit the facts, but when might that have fitted? Let's just see about other candidates to see what else fits the timeline. I've gone here from 1 AD backwards by more than 10 years to see what might have happened. When do we think Christ was born? Well, we don't know, but a number of people believe it was between 4 and 8 BC, possibly around 6 BC. That judgment, that guess, if you like, is based on the fact that it was believed that King Herod died in 4 BC. and Christ was born before Herod died. But certain biblical scholars, I am not amongst them, I'm simply referring to other people's work, certain biblical scholars believe that Herod didn't die in 4 BC. Herod died shortly after a lunar eclipse, and it is believed that perhaps people have taken the wrong lunar eclipse in trying to work out when Herod died. And some people believe that Herod actually died in 1 BC. In which case Christ might have been born in the few years leading up to that. I am not sure why there's a gap between 3 and 4, but people seem to believe it's either between 4 and 8 or possibly between 1 and 3 BC. So again, without making any judgment call on when I believe Herod died, let's just see what astronomical candidates might fit the timeline and fit into one of those grey boxes. So what about comets? Well, there was a comet around in 12 BC, possibly quite a bright one. It was Halley's Comet. We've seen it quite a few times since then, and it was around in 12 BC. One thing we can't be too sure of, well, comets are really like cats. They have tails and they're unpredictable. We can work out where comets are in their orbit, and we can work out where they were in their orbit. What is very difficult to calculate is how bright it would have been, because that depends on the sun evaporating ice from the comet, which then produces the beautiful tails that we sometimes see. And so we can't easily predict how much the sun will evaporate the ice, and therefore we can't predict brightness. But Halley was probably quite a bright comet. But why would that have been the Star of Bethlehem? Surely that was too early. Why would you put something on your Facebook page 5, 6, 7 years before the actual date you were trying to prophesy? So it doesn't seem to fit. There were other comets around in 5 BC and 4 BC. One of them was Comet Holmes, which came around a few years ago and some people have photographed. In 4 BC, there was the comet Churyumov-Gerasimenko, which is a great name, but otherwise called the Rosetta Comet, the comet that was visited by a space probe to land the little Philae lander on a few years back, which you may remember. But both of those comets are probably fairly faint, so although we can work out where they were in the sky, they wouldn't have been spectacular comets, and so those don't seem to fit the bill either. There were what appears to be a couple of nova around the right time. The Chinese have recorded the existence of a nova in 5 BC. A new star appeared on their star maps. And the Koreans recorded a new star in 4 BC. Now, bright nova are not particularly common, so is it a question of you wait for decades and then 2 come along at once? Well, possibly, but it is thought more likely that there's just been a slight miscalculation on dating these 2 things, and perhaps they are both recording the same event. There was a nova somewhere between the end of 5 BC and early 4 BC. Both the Chinese and the Koreans saw something in the sky at about that time. But for the reasons I stated earlier, it doesn't seem like a nova fits the bill, even though the timing appears to be about right for that first grey block as the possibility of the birth of Christ. What I think is more interesting is the fact that there were planetary conjunctions. And here again I'm using the symbols. That's the symbol for conjunction, and I'm using the astrological symbols for brevity for Jupiter, Saturn and Venus. And there they are down the left-hand side if you forget which is which. So there were conjunctions of Jupiter with Saturn at about the right time if you believe that Christ was born somewhere around 5 or 6 BC. But I think much more interesting is what was going on here, the conjunctions of Venus and Jupiter. And so we're going to look at some planetarium software. Rather than run the software, I'm going to show you videos of the software which I ran earlier, because that's just a little bit easier to do with Zoom compared to a live talk, as it were. So you're not going to be able to read all of these details, so let me talk you through what we're looking at here. We've asked the planetarium software to show us a chunk of sky around about the constellation of Leo. I am not going to label everything in the sky, because if you put a label on everything, it gets far too confusing. So I've labelled the constellations, the constellation of Leo, the constellation of Cancer, over here is Gemini, etc. So the zodiacal constellations are running across the sky like this. And you can see that I've labelled the planet Jupiter, and there are other planets in the sky that I haven't labelled because otherwise it gets really messy. The other thing I haven't done is put the horizon in so you can see how high they were above the ground, visible at a certain time of day, because again, I'm going to run this as a time lapse forward and I don't want the horizon to be jumping around all over the place. I'm just going to be concentrating on what's going on in this part of the sky. So at the moment, I've asked it to show what the sky was like on the 1st of August 3 BC at 20 past 6. So it's about tea time on the 1st of August 3 BC. I don't know where on earth we should be looking from because I don't know where the Magi were, whether in India or Mongolia or somewhere else. So I've simply said geographically I don't know where we should be thinking about our observation being based, so I've simply said let's look from the centre of the Earth. In other words, let's just take the Earth away and just imagine we're in the centre of the Earth. If we're actually in India or Mongolia, it'll only shift our position by a few thousand miles. The planets will still be in essentially the same direction, so it doesn't really matter. Okay, so it's August of 3 BC at about tea time, and I'm going to run through one day at a time. Now the first thing that's going to happen is that most of these planets are moving from west to east, from right to left as we see them here. And what's happening is Jupiter is going to move to our left, and coming up behind it is the planet Venus, which is closer to the Sun, so it's moving faster, and Venus is going to catch up Jupiter. So let's just move forward a few days at a time and see what happens. So now we're moving forward to August the 12th. And now you can see that Venus and Jupiter have got very close in the sky. I haven't shown you where the horizon is, but take my word for it. This particular conjunction takes place in the early morning, and the sun hasn't yet risen at this particular time. Sorry, it wouldn't be at 20 past 6, it would be in the morning, but it doesn't really make any difference for this argument. The star would be visible in the morning, just before sunrise. So this would be a star in the east, the close conjunction of two rather bright planets. Venus on its own is a very bright planet, and Jupiter can be almost as bright as well. So when these two planets get close in the sky, it can be quite an impressive sight. How close would they get? Well, if you imagine the full moon is about 1/2 of a degree in diameter. And these two planets would have got a distance from each other somewhat closer than that. In other words, the full moon, if it was placed over these two planets, would have covered them both. They were only a fraction of a degree apart. They would still have appeared as 2 points of light. Anybody with reasonably good eyesight would still have seen them as 2 points of light. They wouldn't actually come close to each other. What generally happens with planets is because their orbits are slightly tilted relative to each other, what tends to happen is one planet passes north or south of the other. But they would have come within a fraction of a degree, within a full moon's diameter of each other. Two very bright planets seen in the morning sky in the east. What interpretation might you apply? Well, Venus is symbolic of birth. Jupiter, remember, is the king of planets. And this conjunction takes place in Leo. Venus and Jupiter in Leo. Venus, birth, Jupiter, king, Leo, the land or the tribe of Judea. Birth, king, Jew. This could be seen as a sign of something interesting is going to happen, and it's related to the birth of the king of the Jews. That would have got the astrologers' attention in August of 3 BC. What happened in the next few months? Let's run the video forward. Venus is moving quite fast, so Venus will go out of shot, and then we're going to watch what happens to Jupiter. Jupiter passes the brightest star of Leo, Regulus. So Jupiter has just passed Regulus. The king of planets has just passed fairly close to the king of stars. And now Jupiter is starting to slow down, and although the clock is still running forward, Jupiter has now stopped in the sky and is now moving backwards. Remember the retrograde motion that I showed before. Jupiter is still moving the same way, but the Earth is overtaking it, making it look like Jupiter's going backwards. And now Jupiter passes Regulus a second time. The king of planets has just passed the king of stars for a second time in the spring of 2 BC. And now Jupiter stops again and then continues its forward motion. And what's it going to do? Yep, it's going to pass Regulus again. The king of planets has just passed the king of stars, not once, not twice, but 3 times over the course of a few months. Now, it's not that unusual for Jupiter to pass Regulus. Regulus is part of the zodiac, and so the planets will pass it from time to time, but it's unusual for Jupiter to undergo its retrograde motion and pass Regulus 3 times. King of planets, king of stars, 3 times in a row. Something is happening about one king dancing around another. One king is perhaps passing his crown to another king. So again, the astrologers are now getting very interested. We've had some sort of a heads up about birth of the King of the Jews, and now we're getting a sign that something interesting is happening about one king passing the crown to another king. What happens a little later, the following month, is quite amazing. Jupiter is going to continue on its motion, and this is Venus having come round. Remember, Venus goes around the sun quite quickly. This is Venus coming round again. So let's run the clock forward from May into June, and now we see Venus catching up with Jupiter. Venus passes Regulus, and now Venus passes close to Jupiter a second time. This time it is very, very close. Not just close enough that it looks really interesting, ooh, isn't that pretty? This time Venus and Jupiter have got so close to each other, no human with normal vision could make them out as 2 separate planets. They would merge together. 2 of the brightest planets in the sky have merged into one very bright object. Let me show you just how close they get. Let me put Jupiter into the center of this particular video, and let me zoom in, because here you can't tell just how close they are. I'm now going to zoom in by about a factor of 1,000 or so. Let's zoom in and see Jupiter and Venus. That's how close they would have been. This field of view is absolutely tiny. Nobody could make those out as 2 separate objects. Venus should be blindingly bright because it's got a white reflective atmosphere. This particular piece of software shows the surface of Venus, the volcanoes, etc. It doesn't show the cloud layer. So you have to imagine this as being a brilliant white Venus and a brilliant Jupiter so close to each other that you couldn't possibly resolve them as 2 separate planets. I don't know how often this happens, but a conjunction this close I wouldn't expect to happen many times in 1,000 years. So I think it's fairly safe to assume that when the astrologers saw this particular event, it would have been an absolute wow event. It would have been something that hadn't ever been seen in their lifetimes. That perhaps was the starting pistol. That was the why are you still here? Why haven't you gone to the land of Judea to honour the birth of the King of the Jews? So let me just remind you of those 4 steps, as it were. In 3 BC, Venus and Jupiter passed fairly close to each other in the constellation of Leo. That would have been the first sign of birth of the King of the Jews. In the following months, the King of Planets passed the King of Stars not once, not twice, but 3 times. A triple conjunction of the King of Planets with the King of Stars. Something was happening about kings passing on the crown from one king to another king. And then a few months later, there was this extremely close conjunction to the point where they merged into a single object, Venus and Jupiter again. The same birth king Jews, again Venus and Jupiter in Leo, but this time a spectacular conjunction of planets that might have been the starting pistol that told the Magi to go to the land of Judea. How long did it take them to get there? Well, we have no way of telling. Remember, we don't know how far they travelled. We don't know if they came from the Near East, from India, from Mongolia, from the Far East. We don't know if they walked. We don't know if they rode on camels. A Christmas card will tell you they're camels, but we don't actually know that. So we don't know how long it would have taken. If June was the point at which they started their journey, we don't know when they would have got to Bethlehem. It is possible they took many months to get there, and it's possible they arrived in December. I say that because something interesting happened in December. Jupiter moved on, but remember how Jupiter goes through this retrograde motion and occasionally stops in the sky? Well, that would have happened again in December. So had they arrived in December, Jupiter would have stopped in the sky. It would have reappeared and stopped in the sky. Whether it stopped over Bethlehem, you can interpret that how you like, but Jupiter did indeed stop in the sky in December of 2 BC. What particular date was it? Well, it was actually December the 25th. But of course, that's nothing to do with Christmas. Christmas, we know, is a festival that the date of which overtook a pagan festival. So there's no particular historical reference to December the 25th, but that's when Jupiter happened to stop in the sky. Whether that's anything to do with the timing of the pagan festival, well, the pagan festival is really just celebrating the end of midwinter, the end of the shortest day, the longest night. So the fact that that's the day that Jupiter happens to stop in the sky is simply a coincidence. But we can see that there's this pattern of astronomical events leading from August 3 BC through to the end of 2 BC, and if we follow that pattern we can see why the astrologers might have come to the conclusions about the birth of the King of the Jews and then slotting it in to the account according to St. Matthew. So to summarise, maybe it was these conjunctions of Jupiter and Venus in the constellation of Leo that inspired the account in the Gospel of St. Matthew. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was something completely different. Maybe it was a combination of events. Maybe it was conjunction of planets and a comet and a supernova. Who knows what particular things might have happened there that occurred. If they occurred at the right time, they could have inspired the Gospel according to St. Matthew. Determining the facts, we know where Jupiter was, we know where Venus was, we can time the conjunctions accurately even though they were 2,000 years ago. We know what comets were in the sky. We can't tell how bright they were, but we know the comets were there. Determining the astronomical facts is relatively easy. We just take where the planets are now and wind the clock back 2,000 years. We can't wind the clock back 2 million years, but winding it back 2,000 years is reasonably reliable. So we know that these astronomical events did take place. But second-guessing the significance that the Magi or other astrologers would have attributed to those events, that's a different matter. That, of course, is pure speculation. The bottom line is, regardless, the underlying message is, of course, still the same. I'd like to wish you all a peaceful and Merry Christmas. Thank you all for listening.